Okay, well, thank you very much. It's good to be back in Pakistan. I was going to start by just thanking this very distinguished panel. We've been having a lot of thanks to the researchers for coming to these conferences, and it's worth mentioning that we can't exist without policymakers coming to the conferences and working with us. So we're basically at the 5-year mark on the IGC. And I think what sort of come across very strongly in this conference is kind of two things. One is that this is a place where the policy community comes together with the frontier research community, which is something which hasn't happened a lot in the past. And secondly, that there's this value which comes from that collaboration of co-generation of knowledge, and not, so that basically the policy implementing partners and the researchers working together. So turning now to sort of my rather limited experience of Pakistan, there's sort of two things that have drawn me into Pakistan. The first, which is happening at the moment, hopefully at an increasing pace, is thawing of trade relations between India and Pakistan. And indeed, based on a sort of early conversation with Ijaz Nabi, myself and Dave Donaldson at MIT and Steve Redding at Princeton have started working actually on not the current liberalization, but what happened at the point of partition. And what's interesting about that work is that it really suggests that when you put a barrier in between both East and West Pakistan and India, that had fairly large negative consequences for GDP. So as we look forward, the sort of obverse of that argument is that the coming and ongoing liberalization between India and Pakistan, and to some extent also between Bangladesh and India, and in some grand sense across all of South Asia, and probably extending all the way into Myanmar, is going to bring significant benefits to the South Asian region. So one of the reasons I'm here today and at this conference is that I'm very interested in pursuing a study of this liberalization episode with the same co-authors, Dave Donaldson and Steve Redding, in collaboration with the FBR chairman Tariq Bajwa. So that's sort of one, from a sort of personal standpoint. I'm here to see whether we can do something on that front. And then the second reason, which is what I'm actually going to talk about today, is the whole set of energy issues, which, to be honest, I know quite a bit about those issues in the context of India. I'm still very much a student in terms of the Pakistani context. So let me just begin by also saying that a sort of personal thank you to Ijaz Nabi, to Naved Hamid, to Ali Chima, and to Asim Khwaja, not only for putting on this great conference, but also just to personally experience the explosion of research that has taken place in Pakistan, which we are now seeing feeding into policy, and to obviously observe that also occurring in Bihar and India more generally, and also in Bangladesh, and hopefully the success will be repeated in Myanmar. Why that's important is I think that this sort of goes back to my first point, which is there is something here. There is something that is worthwhile in this collaboration. So in short, long may it continue. So now narrowing down to the very narrow issue of energy in South Asia. It also is worth mentioning that that both in the context of the work that we've been doing in India and elsewhere, and in the context of the IGC generally, the funding from the Department for International Development has been central to those efforts. So I just wanted to sort of end the thanks to DFID. Now, usually you say thank you to your organizers and so forth. On this particular context of energy, I'm going to say thank you to the multiple blackouts that have been occurring during the conference, and the fact that the energy sector enjoys front page So when I opened my newspaper this morning, on the front page, not on the back pages, but on the front page, there was an issue about load shedding in Pakistan. So this gives us some sense, and it certainly does a better job than I could ever do, about how central this issue is both to Pakistan but also to the other countries in South Asia. And it's central not just because we're experiencing these blackouts, and that it's central for a more fundamental reason, and it's sort of captured by these figures. So these are the figures gathered from a document called the CIA Fact Book as to the per capita energy consumption, average per capita energy consumption in the different countries in South Asia relative to the US. So you can see that India has the highest percentage, but it's still tiny. 4% of average US per capita energy consumption. Pakistan is next, Bangladesh is next, Bihar is next, so Bihar is low by Indian standards. And most surprisingly to me, Myanmar is even lower. So Bihar is 1/100th of the energy consumption of the US. So this includes both for industrial and residential use. And why I think these are such fundamental figures is that you have to then think about a human being with, say, in the case of Pakistan, 3% of the energy consumption of the US, or in the case of Myanmar, 0.5%. Just what can that human being accomplish in terms of the sets of, for example, production activities that they can actually engage in? It's such a fundamental disconnect. So to me, from my limited experience in India, looking at energy, it looks to me like the whole set of issues around energy are probably even more fundamental than some of the issues around, for example, health and education, in terms of at least the failure of delivery on that front. Now one might say, well, the US consumes too much energy. It's consuming too much energy. But if one then compares, say, to countries that have engaged in significant expansion in access to electricity, so for example, China and Brazil, the numbers look much, much larger, right? So if you were to take, say, a European country like Denmark, they'd be about half the US. But what this is telling us is that Pakistan only has 1/10 of the energy at its disposal for the average citizen relative to China. And China and Brazil are notable because they have successfully, more or less, expanded access to almost all citizens. Something which, when we're talking about blackouts, of course, we're only talking about people who are already connected but aren't receiving constant access to energy. So it's very clear that from those initial figures that the problems are not in any way specific to Pakistan. They're shared across all South Asian countries, and they're probably one of the main impediments to economic growth in the region. So I think that that why I'm speaking to this issue today, which is very much a prospective talk, we haven't actually done any research in Pakistan, is because I think there is scope to do very interesting research in this particular area. And again, it's an area which requires co-generation of knowledge, because it requires, for example, working with government of Pakistan, it requires working with distribution companies, so it's not something that you can do on your own as a researcher. So there's kind of three big factors if you look at the energy field as a whole, as far as I can make out. The first is that, as I already pointed out, access is very limited in developing countries. But somewhat a sort of parallel to that, which surprised me, is actually even despite that, there is so much demand for electricity, unmet demand, that actually projected growth will mainly occur in the developing countries. So in other words, the developed countries are getting more or less what they want. They're sort of fairly flat, and then you're going to have this huge increase in demand from the developing countries, precisely as people begin to get electricity in their homes, to begin to buy appliances, begin to run vehicles, to begin to be involved in jobs that require electricity in the manufacturing and service sectors. You're going to see this huge increase, as you're already seeing in countries like India and Pakistan. So the other third factor, which I think is worth mentioning, is that there's a cost to that energy consumption. So what is the cost? Well, there's two principal costs. One is pollution, which is rising everywhere. So this is particulate pollution, air pollution, water pollution. Rima Hanna, who's working with us on the energy team, has done a lot of work with Michael Greenstone on this issue in India. And then there's finally this big area of warming, of global warming. And as a sort of, I guess as a call to arms or a call to action, I'm going to present a little bit of work on India that suggests that these, in the case of warming, that those costs are going to be most keenly felt by citizens in developing nations, not in the developed nations. So this is a graph just showing you how the developing nations are going to have. So in other words, the future growth of energy consumption is going to be driven by the developing nations, and that, of course, drives emissions. It drives, air pollution. It drives water pollution. It drives warming. Okay. And why I put those three things up is the result of that is, and on top of that, those costs are going to be felt most by those populations in those countries, means that we need to start thinking now about what measures we can take to mitigate those costs. So I think that the sort of central core of this talk, which is something I've been convincing myself over time, is that access to reliable energy is a first order issue for economic growth. And that's really about the first thing, which is the problem. So the first thing is that it really fundamentally affects the production possibilities of citizens, not just obviously in South Asia, but across the world. So the set of things that people can do, I mean, think about it. If you have no electricity, what are the production activities that people can be involved in? They're somewhat limited. So remember, that's completely separate. That's a world with no access to electricity. That is a world that a lot of South Asians inhabit. What we're talking about today, there's blackouts. We have some electricity at the moment. It goes off occasionally. The generator turns on at much higher cost. So these are separate issues. And it's not causal, but there's no doubt that dramatically lower energy, and we're talking really dramatically here. Remember, we're talking 100th, 200th, 50%. These are very big gaps between energy consumption in the developed world and in the developing world. And they're clearly correlated, probably because of these constraints on the types of economic activities you can engage in, with much lower standards of living. Okay? The other, and I haven't gone through the detail of how this figure, but this figure is all over the place, that clearly the inefficiencies in the sector have negative implications for economic growth. So the figure that one hears is this 2% of GDP lost to power outages. So that's just power outages. That's not taking into account the fact that the people who have no access to electricity are themselves constrained in what they can do. Okay, this is just a graph showing that GDP per capita and electricity consumption per capita is correlated. And this is a somewhat more interesting graph, not because of, it's something that's obvious to everyone in this room, that as you become richer, you move your source of energy upwards. But it's interesting both from a health perspective, in other words, the fuels at the top are more healthy to use, they're cleaner. But perhaps more importantly, from an economics point of view, the stuff at the top allows you to do more stuff. So the stuff you can do with charcoal, with kerosene, with coal, with firewood are basic. You can't run machines, you can't run computers, and so forth. So there's a growth in productive opportunities as well as a health advantage as you move upwards to these cleaner fuels. And the way I like to think about it is that the kind of industrial revolution is unfinished business in the developing world. It's almost and by what I mean by that, I'm going to come back to this in thinking about the effects of weather on mortality, is that basically large swathes of the population are dependent on unproductive and risky production technologies. So the big category, obviously, in South Asia is rain-fed agriculture. And within that category, groups like landless laborers, small cultivators, and the like, which still occupy a huge chunk of the labor force. So what that means is that rapid structural change and urbanization, which all the countries in South Asia are trying to achieve, is predicated on their citizens getting access to reliable sources of energy. And this is going to be particularly important if a country is liberalizing trade with other countries. Why is that the case? Well, because of course there's a cost of energy. And if every time the electricity goes off you have to bring in a generator, then that's going to add to your costs. It's also going to bring in a huge amount of uncertainty in the production processes, which means that perhaps you can only deliver on contracts. You're not on time on contracts. Inputs into your production process may arrive later. So the whole system of industry, whether that's in the service sector or in the manufacturing sector, is compromised when you have very unreliable access to energy. So and what that means is that if you're trading with another country which has a better organized electricity sector, you're at a disadvantage. So there's actually a case for improving the electricity sector in order to improve the degree to which you benefit from the liberalization of trade with other countries, which is a big issue right now in South Asia. So I'm just going to do a bit of a sort of a scare story now to kind of bring home why I think both that access to energy is not just about important just for industrialization, but it's important for essentially bringing people who for centuries have been engaged in very unproductive activities into the modern sector. So this is a graph, just to understand, because there's a few of these and I don't want to spend too much time on them. But this is a graph for India for the whole, the period 1957 to 2000. And what it does is compare one day in the 70 to 72 degree Fahrenheit bin to other days. And this is just agricultural yields, and it's for all districts of India. So what you can see in this graph is, perhaps not surprisingly to those who know Indian agriculture, that it declines as you get. So what it's saying is that for a day, say in the 97 and above Fahrenheit bin, you get about a 0.5% decline in agricultural yields. Okay, so what it's saying is that agriculture is weather dependent. There's not irrigation to smooth these things over. So the amount that is produced on a piece of land in India is lower when the weather is hotter. Okay? So that's sort of step one. The second step is to compare, now this is now mortality, so we're looking at annual mortality figures for Indian districts, again for 57 to 2000. And the blue line is for the US, for counties over a similar period. And what you basically see is that as you rise above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 32 degrees Celsius, you start to see an increase in mortality. Okay, so mortality, so at the end, you're getting for every day above 97 degrees Fahrenheit, you're getting about a 0.75% increase in the mortality rate relative to a day in the 70 to 72 bin. So that's a huge effect, right? And we don't see that happening in the US. Why is that? Well, the main explanation comes in the next figure, which is now we compare the death rates for Indian districts, but split out by rural and urban populations. And what you see there is that the red is the rural. So essentially all that effect that you saw for India is being driven by elevated death rates for the rural populations. And remember, this is not a period of global warming. This is now. This is the post-independent 57 to 2000 period in India. Okay? And what it's saying is that people in India are not fully insured against weather risk, in this case temperature risk, whereas people in urban India are. In other words, there is an advantage for all the other ills of living in cities of moving from the countryside to a city. And then things get scarier, obviously, if you consider warming. So what I've done so far has nothing to do with warming, but this is sort of some projected figures on warming. And what this means is that if you look at this histogram here, the red bars are predicted temperatures for India for 27, on average between 2070 and 2099, and the blue bars are the averages over the period between 1957 and 2000. And what's basically happening is the distribution's moving to the right. And why that's so important is that there's going to be many more days in the hot region, particularly in that region 97 plus, 90 plus region. And so if you multiply in a sort of, those increased number of days times the coefficients you saw in the previous graph, you're going to get very elevated mortality rates. And so what I'm getting at is that access to energy and allowing people to move away from very basic agriculture, either into other activities in the rural areas, which are less weather dependent, or to move into the cities, will have a large bearing on the degree to which people are protected from the coming warming. And in the final sort of figure on this, the blue bars are the effects on the urban population in India, the red are the effects on the rural population, and those are losses in life expectancy, ceteris paribus obviously, for different periods. And you can see that the losses start to become significant fairly soon, according to the projected increases in temperature from a standard sort of business as usual climate change model. So why I'm doing this is it's important to think about access to energy, obviously to drive industrialization, to promote the service sector, to promote the manufacturing sector, but it also has a big role in getting people out of activities which are both unproductive and, as these sort of graphs have demonstrated, also risky, where people are not fully insured against weather risk. So I'm not going to, in any detail, go through the different reasons why access to energy transforms lives, but these are a few, and I think a lot of them have to do with production, so allowing new types of production activities, the creation and expansion of businesses, facilitating communication trade, time allocation, for example, if you're using electric cooking relative to gathering firewood, insurance against shocks, and health. But there is, as it's sort of been discussed a little bit in the conference so far, there's big challenges to building an effective electricity sector. So now what I want to do is sort of shift gears a little bit. I've given you some context to why access to energy, I think access to energy is incredibly important, and actually move into a more focused discussion about what can we do about that issue. And I must say at the outset, I'm not an expert on the energy sector in Pakistan, so these are just some ideas which will hopefully lead to collaborative projects with groups in Pakistan. So what we've basically got is what I would describe as a low quality equilibrium. So on the one hand, energy suppliers are trying to achieve a multitude of goals. So for example, using subsidies to try to benefit particular groups, as well as trying to raise revenue for their activities. So that's a sort of a fundamental problem. There's high rates of non-payment and theft, which further erodes the revenue base. And the lack of revenue then severely limits the ability to expand access and improve quality. Okay? So what that means is that those characteristics, which really have to do with the demand side of this, then not only limit investment in the power distribution sector, they also limit investment in the power generation sector. Because in effect, you're dealing with a non-viable business. The implications of that, which we're experiencing today, frequent outages, widespread lack of access, reliance on higher costs, and this is very important. So if you have to rely on diesel, it costs a lot more per unit of energy to generate. And in effect, what we have is a very heavy misallocation of resources. So for example, industry finds it expensive to get hold of electricity, but they value that electricity very highly, whereas agriculture finds it cheap, despite the fact that their valuation of each unit of electricity is low. These are the 4 areas that I should have said that Michael Greenstone is the director of the IGC Energy Program, so one of the 4 research programs that we're focusing on. These are 4 areas that we are working on, and I'm going to mention some projects that fit into them in Pakistan, prospective possible projects. But I think that the sort of, some of the core ideas, sort of starting from the bottom, is we're going to have to think about the costs. And so REMA has done a lot of work on environmental regulation in India with Michael. Michael's done a lot of work on pollution in China. You know, several people are trying to do work on warming. But a lot of what we're talking about is not just the cost, it's about actually expanding access, increasing consumption of electricity. And some of the ideas there are, you're going to have to incentivize people to pay for the energy that they consume. So we'll be going through some examples of how that might be done in Pakistan. But I think it's worth mentioning that you need to have political will behind you. So in my sort of learning experiment, if you like, in Bihar, it was hugely useful that Nitish Kumar had basically said, I will not run in the next state elections unless Bihar becomes sufficient in energy. That was the political will. That was saying we need to do something here, we need to do something big. And then of course, that's passed down. The person we're working with in Bihar is Sandeep Pandrik, who's the Secretary of the Energy Department. And we're trying out different things to expand. But one of the things we're trying out is essentially at the feeder level to incentivize communities of about 2,500 people, both in rural and urban areas, to pay higher percentages of their bills. And in return for paying those higher percentages of the bills, they receive more hours of electricity. And that's something which we're going to mention may be possible in Pakistan. We're also doing work, again with Pandrik, on a lot of the transmission lines are there in Bihar, but how do you get the revenue that allows you to purchase energy or generate it that then you can pass down those lines? So I think rural electrification, whether or not it's subsidized, is an incredibly important area. And Bihar just happens to be a state of India where the rate of electrification is extremely low. In other words, huge proportions of the villages in Bihar don't have any electricity coming into them. And then a third area, which we're beginning to work on a little bit in Rwanda, is talking about energy efficiency. So if you want to consume less energy, one way to do that is to have use less energy per unit of output. And there's various ideas that are coming from both the developed world or the developing world on how to do that. And then there's the cost side, which I've already mentioned. So in the final few minutes of the talk, what I wanted to do is firstly emphasize why I think this is really fundamental. And to be honest, why I think it's really fundamental are these 3 things. Raising productivity, why access to electricity is so important. It allows you to raise the productivity both of firms and of individuals. It allows for structural change. What I mean is getting people out of particularly unproductive agriculture and into manufacturing and services. And that can be occurring in rural areas as well as through rural to urban migration. And finally, and most fundamentally, because I think this will be a key factor in sustaining economic growth in South Asia. I should say that, as should be obvious to anybody who's an expert on the energy sector, my focus is pretty much on the demand side, right? So I'm leaving aside the building of new coal plants, those things. Every country I've been to always says that first. Oh, when I first went to Bihar, we need to get coal linkages, then we're going to build a coal plant, then we're going to get energy. But what I'm going to try to argue today is reasonably quickly you can make big improvements by changing the incentives on the demand side. So I'm not saying it's a full, it's not the full picture. There's going to have to be structural reforms on the supply side as well. But I think you can achieve a lot on the demand side. And I'll now get into some specifics on what we might do. Okay. So sort of bringing in Pakistan, I think, as I've already emphasized, distribution reform is the key to a financially sustainable electricity sector. And principally what you've got to do, and this is not specific to Pakistan, is to break the cycle of circular debt. Okay, so what I mean is this is what's supposed to be happening. So, people pay, that's passed up to the distribution companies, that's passed up to the Central Power Purchasing Authority, that's passed up to generation. This is actually what's happening, right? So debt is passed from one unit to the next, and then that's passed to the government of Pakistan, and then that's passed to the taxpayer, right? So basically there's this bailout of debt. And that's obviously a very unattractive business to invest in, okay? So this is a picture which is pretty striking about the growth in circular debt in Pakistan. This is an even more striking picture that shows that the deficit, the electricity shortfall, basically has the same shape as the rise in the subsidy to the power sector. So there's something deeply wrong in the whole industry in Pakistan. So let me close by just mentioning three ideas, and I should emphasize that we're basically here to try to get some business on, get some research going in these areas. The first side, which I think is an area which is often used in developed countries, is the whole area of demand side management. And I'll give you some for industrial consumers. So this is the idea that the demand for electricity is very humped. There's peak periods when electricity demand is highest. So you're basically incentivizing industrial consumers to use electricity away from those peaks, right? To avoid the kind of situation that leads to outages and the like. The second is very related to the stuff that we're doing in Bihar, which is essentially offering so basically put very simply, what happens if I don't pay my electricity bill in England, whether I'm a firm or a residential consumers? Well, I'll tell you what happens. They close off the electricity. No more electricity, right? So we're not talking about taking it right down to the household or the firm, but we're talking about doing it at a feeder level, which is, I think, a sort of a middle ground that is viable. And then the final bit, which is an issue throughout South Asia, is the whole question about what do we do about subsidies to particular sectors like agriculture. So let me take those in turn, and then I will close. So the problem, particularly on the industrial side, is that industrial output suffers from irregular supply and rationing at peak times. And I think that this is a really deep problem which we haven't fully analyzed, the consequences of having to live in a world where you don't know when the electricity will be on or off. And I think it has consequences for things extending all the way into your ability to trade competitively with other countries. So the idea, which is by no means our idea, is that you can use demand-side management to reduce demand-supply gap at peaks. So you pay industrial consumers willing to cut back at peaks and move production to other times. So this is voluntary, and it has it solves three problems. One, it improves the allocation of power available, because only industries willing to reduce demand cheaply are called back on to cut back demand. In other words, you decide, is this worth doing? It then also compensates industries for their inconvenience, so they just get paid like generators would. And what's really critical here is that there's a gain to the cutting back firm, but there's also general equilibrium gain, because if you avoid that supply gap at the peak times, then the number of outages goes down. So in other words, across the whole industry, even if you're not participating in the scheme, the regularity of electricity supply improves. So this is something, Pakistan is by no means the only place that suffers from outages, and we've had outages in developed countries as well, California being a good example. And so these are sort of mechanisms that have been developed to avoid the types of outages which are in this country, as we already noticed, each one of us extremely common. So what the hope is then is you'd have reduced cost of power outages, and this would contribute to industrial growth. So in a prospective pilot, what would we need to actually look at this issue? We would need to collaborate with a DISCOM, a distribution company, with a large industrial customer base. So we'd need to find a partner who is willing to work with us. We need to have time of use, remotely readable metering to monitor consumption in real time, which is something which can be gathered. And then you need a bidding and payment system, because obviously you have to voluntarily decide whether you're going to participate in the scheme. And many private companies run these types of systems. So that's one idea, and I think it's one that could have sort of fundamental impacts on the frequency of outages. Okay. The second, which is sort of graphed out here, is a sort of feeder level power allocation scheme. So this is a scheme where you have a problem of high theft, low payment areas, and that starts the cycle of debt. In other words, people who don't pay, whether they're industrial consumers or residential consumers, contribute to the accumulation of debt. So basically the idea here is, how do you incentivize people to pay their electricity bills? And what would happen here is you would link the power supply, so because you have the ability to shed power at the feeder level, to the payment rate in order to incentivize payments. Okay, so it's, at the moment, given current technologies, it's difficult to meter in every house or every firm. So what we're proposing is to do this at the feeder level, which in Bihar is about 2,500 households. And on top of that, we could also think of adding collector incentives. So very much going back to the work of Adnan and co., adding incentives for electricity collectors. Because what's interesting here, even if people aren't paying the government, they may be paying somebody else to not pay the government, right? So you want to think of ways of, in effect, replacing paying the government and getting rid of bribery. And I think this is an interesting scheme. So what we would need is reliable feeder level metering to monitor consumption by area, so automated meter reading. We need energy accounting revenue data at the feeder level. So this is obviously something we would do directly with government, and we need the political will to adhere to the schedule, which I gather from my informal conversations with people in Pakistan, may pose some problems. But I think this is a scheme which is worth considering. So just to give you an example, this is the scheme that we're using in Bihar, where you can see that the hours of electricity vary according to the percentage of payment of bills. So you get more electricity the lower the distribution and collection losses. So this is actually happening at the moment in Bihar, with some negative reactions, but the government, as I say, has the political will to push through these reforms, and is in a very difficult situation where the revenue that is coming from the customers, both industrial and residential, is too small to fund the types of activities that they want to do within the energy sector. And then finally, the final sort of potential pilot that we could be engaged in is, you'll notice here, and this is from a planning commission data, that agriculture, as in many countries, a large part of subsidies are in agriculture. And the argument is that the subsidies that are actually targeted, why do you give subsidies? Well, there's some sort of argument that people don't have the ability to pay. that subsidy is sort of spread across many people, both in residential, industrial, who do have the ability to pay, but nonetheless would prefer to enjoy the subsidy. So the argument here is that the subsidy that's going to the truly needy group is what's called domestic lifeline, is only 0.3%, and a lot of the other subsidies are not going to people who would have any difficulty paying for their electricity, but nonetheless, of course, they would prefer to pay at a reduced price. So what do you do in this situation? As I say, this is a very common situation, and certainly not exclusively to South Asia, this subsidization of agricultural use. So one idea is that you would, so there's a subsidies and a non-payment issue with agricultural users, is to trade a lump sum payment equal to past bills. So you would compensate people for the fact they haven't paid for a long time, but then get the agreement for them to go on to a regular tariff. In other words, a tariff that actually would cover the cost of the generation of the electricity with the necessary profit margin. And what's interesting here is that, potentially both sides gain, from the customer from the lump sum distribution, and the company from having prices to cover the cost and lower consumption of consumer. So what I'm doing is I'm going back to that sort of central problem, which is if you can't cover your costs, so if people are not paying for the services, then you're going to lead to this problem where all the improvements you would like to do to quality, whether that's expanding the number of hours that people get, to reducing outages, to connecting people, that group that I was talking about, in India who are severely affected by weather shocks, all those activities are severely constrained. In other words, you need to do something about the profitability and viability of the industry in order to fund those activities. So I will. So to pilot this particular idea, we would need reliable metering to monitor consumption from tube wells, a distribution company. Again, we need to partner with a distribution company to implement and credibly make lump sum transfers. And again, the political support is critical to allow experimentation with the tariff, even if it's on a voluntary and pilot basis. So let me just finish here with sort of three final points. I do think there is a fairly strong case for energy being a major impediment to economic growth. And I think it's also the case, obviously other factors are important, human capital, access to credit and so forth. But I think it is really the case that when you take the inequality, as it were, in access to energy across the world, that significant occupational and structural change cannot take place without improvements in access to energy. So we're going to have to at least move towards something like China and Brazil. We're hopefully not going to get to the US, but we need to at least move to the sort of China-Brazil levels if we're going to if we're going to sort of support the kind of movement of people out of very basic agriculture into manufacturing and services. And finally, as a sort of plug for the IGC, I do think that the co-generation of knowledge in this particular sector with implementing partners, the government of Pakistan with the distribution companies, could supply new ideas on relaxing this key constraint to economic growth. So I think there's a real opportunity here to engage in some new collaboration, sort of following in the footsteps of what Rima and Michael and others have been doing in India, that myself, Michael, and Nick Ryan have been doing in Bihar. And hopefully there'll be some willing partners in Pakistan. Thank you very much.